Ladies and gentlemen, MythVision podcast, Dr. Dennis MacDonald has his mimesis hypothesis, and that is that the Gospels are not only using the Septuagint in the development and narrative of their Jesus stories we call Gospels, including Acts, which would be kind of the narrative of the early church. It's early church mythos, if you will, one of the early ones that actually describes it. And he gets a lot of flack, lots of criticism. Typically, he gets it from Christian apologists, at least of late. What I find about the online community when it comes to Christian apologists and what we do here at MythVision is they go to anyone who has a disagreement with the scholars we have on, latching on to them as a way of saying poo-poo to this academic. And I want to give you a visual before we begin on showing you what I'm talking about. So, Neil, can you pop that up for me? I don't know how you did it. Okay, let's make that full screen for a second. So, real quick, to give you into the drama for a moment and why we have Dennis here is to actually respond to his academic colleagues, the criticisms that he has received in his field pertaining to his work about mimesis criticism. But this is our launching point to give you an idea about the online world. In fact, this is new to Dennis. Dennis has no clue what I'm actually showing here today. Dennis, there is an online biologist, which is not even in New Testament studies, named Jonathan McClatchy. I'm sure he's an avid learner and reader and an interest of New Testament stuff. I hear his dad might be a preacher or something. And that he says that someone who holds a PhD from Harvard, Dennis MacDonald, argues that Mark and Acts are intentionally mimicking the Homeric epics does not render such a view credible. It simply shows that people with advanced degrees from Harvard can hold to really silly positions. Michael Jones, who's a well-known apologist online I'm buddies with, writes, his ideas are rejected by the overwhelming majority of the scholarly community. And by the way, I think that same potion there could be drank on his own channel. Several of the positions Michael Jones holds to is far from the consensus on Hebrew Bible and probably in New Testament studies as well. But I'm aware of, from talking to the Hebrew Bible scholars that I have on, that several of the positions he holds are far from consensus. But it's interesting when a critic coming close to the resurrection or New Testament comes on, you find that the majority counts. However, we're going to get into this too. One more I thought was interesting. Oh, there's this guy named Derek Lambert who commented saying, silly McClatchy seemed triggered of late. Several academics trained in New Testament studies and classics agree with Dennis that these authors are working off of Homeric epics and Aeneid. Consensus be damned, especially when they haven't even read his work. Your last rant on Twitter about how grieved you were that your scholars don't get much attention. It sounds like persecution complex. I think I'll make another video today promoting more of MacDonald's work for more to look into. Mike Winger, a very well-known Christian apologist pastor guy. I actually had someone comment about this just recently in a video. They made the copying Homer claim. It was one of those days when I just didn't have time to respond and felt sad that I was leaving them in such a state. And my buddy Trey Brickley, he actually says, look, I love watching these guys go back and forth, but really sad. He's not happy with the way that the Christians are responding to the situation. Anywho, there's a little teased drama for everybody. And
he also went on Twitter. I'm going to show you.
Share yours. Yeah. Feel free to share yours.
It's the same thing. It's exactly the same text. Copy pasted it. But I also decided to chip in and give my 2 cents. And
right.
I bet you my life savings he has never read the material. And I honestly think that,
without a doubt.
And the reason why I think that is because they know that the Old Testament is being there's a mimesis happening from the Old Testament to the New Testament. They know that process is taking place in the text. So why would it be so crazy to think that the process of mimesis can happen in another text? And by the way, remember this, like we forget this. There was no Bible yet. So these New Testament texts are not like, we're the New Testament, so we're going to stick to Judaism. We're going to, no. This was a text by itself, and it had free range to copy from anywhere it wanted to copy from. All material is free game.
Neil, it's even better than that. And I'm giving Dennis the pat as we lead into this. Dennis is going to take the gloves off and go swinging here. And I'm glad. It's finally time, I think Dennis really stands up for his work. He spent his entire career mostly showing this eureka of his life. I mean, you want to talk about a born-again experience? Discovering this will blow you away. So Dennis, what happens is these apologists, just like a recent response from my buddy Eric Manning, who I would consider in that very conservative, needs this to be true camp. And he responded by playing one of the shorts that I've played. I like different voices from Bart Ehrman, who denies the whole Greek connection. And so what they do is they find an academic that doesn't agree with you and they latch onto it. So they found a list of academics who've criticized your work in the past, and they go, look, they don't accept it. They haven't even read it, but they don't accept it. This is so outlandish to them. What Neil just said, couple that with the fact that this is Greek literature. This isn't Aramaic literature. This isn't Hebrew literature. This is within the vein of Greek literature. That alone should make anyone with eyeballs consider this and go, okay, so it's Greek literature. What they need, in my opinion, is training wheels, or they need someone to go, it is written. Therefore, because it says it is written, their job's easy. And they haven't really investigated that. That gets into some of these criteria and some of these particular issues that we're going to display, Dennis. So I want to put you on the front row here, Neil. There you go.
I got you.
Take us into it.
Are you talking to me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I knew that there would be pushback from conservative religious types, and I'm not interested in having them ditch their religion. I'm interested in making their religion smarter and giving them more tools to appreciate these marvelous texts. I would insist that I love the Gospels more than anybody I know, and they certainly love them better than people who are trying to defend orthodoxy, who really haven't read them critically, and they haven't read them in Greek, and they haven't compared them with the cultural materials around them. I was not entirely prepared for the pushback that I got from my own academy, and it has been painful. Now, I do know that there are scholars who are warming up to the idea, and I would be the first person to point out weaknesses in some of my examples, and I'm a pioneer, but I'm not the major settler. And so I'm waiting for the next generation of scholars to use mimesis criticism as another tool for uncovering the sophistication of these texts and how they mean. If I could give an image, I think that the tide is rising on mimesis criticism so that there is a kind of incremental appreciation for it. And I'm surprised by and encouraged by some scholars that I esteem very much, who are warming to the idea and are in fact incorporating some of those insights into their own work. What I'm hoping for, though, is not a rise in the tide, but a tsunami. I'm waiting for the waves of critics all of a sudden to say, MacDonald is on to something. He's pointing in the right direction. There may be problems in some of his methodologies or so on. But to say that what I've done in my whole career is silly by someone who hasn't written my texts, my work, I just find that reprehensible. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I think it's too bad that McClatchy is a fellow Scot. The MacDonalds and the McClatchys, I guess, are going to have a feud. So I've listed some of these objections in a display that I sent to you, Derek.
Would you like me to show those?
I think that would be helpful because I articulate there.
While he's pulling that up, I just wanted to say something real quick. if you're going to be that critical of another scholar like yourself, at least show the people why it's silly. At least say, hey, the thing he said about the demoniac, or the thing he said about the Euroclea thing, or the thing he said about Eutychus falling, if he was, then it would show you read it. But he just went off and just said it's stupid without saying anything about it, showing he hasn't read it. That to me is embarrassing. It makes
well,
it's
the same
so
thing
embarrassing.
happened. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's very embarrassing because these are the same people who want to be taken seriously on their undesigned coincidences. And so while they're screaming on the internet world saying, please take our undesigned coincidences seriously. And then when people do take them seriously and aren't convinced or have other alternative explanations they think are better in explaining the data, then it's like, okay, well, at least we're engaging. For me, I think what really goes right through the undesigned coincidence thing is the fact that this literature is aware of itself. These authors know the other works. Like, for example, the undesigned coincidence they bring up in Acts, they pretend that the book of Acts does not know Pauline letters, does not know the letters. So how does it know this information? It must be historical eyewitnesses, or this author is really a true companion of Paul and didn't have his letters necessarily in order to get this information. So this is the kind of approach they want to take. They want to be taken seriously, but they want to silly your work to the side.
Yeah. Now, I don't do much with the apologists,
Right.
simply because I know I'm not going to convince them, and I don't have an audience for their audience. But I'm surprised that scholars in my field dismiss my work on as a priori without looking at the text either. So I over and over again, I've wanted people to say, well, how do you explain these parallels unless it's mimetic? Now, by the way, mimesis for me does not mean that people need to have a copy of Homer or whatever in front of them. In fact, it's more likely that Quintilian was right in having his students read a story over and over and over again in order to digest it, and then to pull it back as a cow does cud and chew it again and make it their own. Or like a bee that goes from flower to flower, collecting pollen that you can use to make your own honey. So that you have eclectic mimesis, that is more than one text informing a story. So I think mimesis means literary imitation, but it doesn't need to have visual immediate access to the text in order to be imitated. And in fact, it certainly is possible, and my guess is that it's likely in several cases where the author is not looking at a text or thinking of a text at all, but of the Homeric story that has such cachet in the culture that he can expect his readers to know about it. This would be the case, for example, with Lucian in his satires, in my view. So I think I'm not interested in defending my work unless my defending my work makes the understanding of the texts better. I want the text to win. That's much more important than my winning. And you can't get the text to win if you don't read it critically.
Well said.
And so that's one of the things I was hoping that we could do in our time today.
Yeah.
Is actually to take a look at a few stories and their comparisons and to throw down the gauntlet and to say, do you have an alternative explanation for these parallels? If you don't, then I have to say that your denying of this is willful ignorance.
Ooh, well said. Well said.
Okay, so you
somebody
have
clip that. Someone editors out there, go clip that.
right, Dennis. You sent me this yesterday. You formulated this for our episode today, so viewers can kind of actually see a few things on display. But we're going to get into some of the criticism, but some of the problems that you've noticed. Did you want to introduce, or did you want me to read some of this?
Well, I'll coach you in what to read, but I'll start.
Okay.
It was very helpful for me to reread Thomas Kuhn's famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Kuhn notes, for example, that Darwin's evolutionary theory met near early resistance because research had uncovered anomalies, facts inconvenient for biologists in his day. And his work and that of other scientists met with 5 different types of opposition. And I've suffered from opposition like this by everybody. So, Neil, are you able to see this text too?
Yes.
Okay, I think the 3 of us can kind of go through it.
Sure.
I view what I'm finding in parallels in classical Greek poetry to be inconvenient truths to my guild. They're anomalies that step outside of traditional biblical criticism. So let's do it this way. I'll take the first one, denial, and then Neil, you can take the next one, suppression. And Derek, you can take accommodation, and we'll just work through this way. And then we'll work through the list that's below it the same way. So first, denial. Natural scientists may simply ignore inconvenient anomalies by dismissing them ad fontes and pursue their projects undeterred.
Suppression is denial's fraternal twin. If discoveries inconvenient to the reigning matrix do not exist, it is no crime to bury them.
Accommodation. Scientists may concede the occasional anomaly, but instead of abandoning the regnant paradigm, they treat it merely as an unwelcome counter-instance. Kuhn, they will devise numerous articulations and ad hoc modifications of their theory in order to eliminate any apparent conflict.
Methodological assaults, the most productive engagements with unanticipated anomalies, question the reliability of the tools and procedures that claim to have unearthed them.
Marginalization, when defenders of the disciplinary matrix cannot dismiss anomalies as isolated exceptions or flawed science, they might trivialize their significance.
So my work has suffered from all of these instances. Now, here's what I suggest coming up. I didn't know that Neil was going to be with us. So if you could put that back up on the screen, That'd be great. So Derek, you and Neil can alternate where it says Derek. And so you could, and what the way this is set up is you will articulate the position of many in my guild.
Right.
And then I'll give a response to it.
Okay. Your work devalues the influence of Jewish scriptures. I hear this a lot.
Not at all. If you take a look at the synopses of epic tragedy in the Gospels, I include, at least in footnotes, every citation of Jewish scriptures that I'm aware of. And in some of the introductions, I also talk about how mimesis takes place also with biblical texts. Now, I want to say, though, we know that in literary fragments from Egypt from 200 BCE to 200 AD, we have 5 fragments of the Septuagint. We have over 600 from Homer. Now, you tell me what the literary world is of the early Christians.
Say that again, because I have found repetition and constantly reminding people. You said, just to make this correct, 600 Homer's works.
Fragments of Homer's work, 600.
Have been discovered, and you said 5 LXX?
5.
So the preponderance of Greek literature, if you're writing in Greek, that was being used would have been Homer.
And also, the Septuagint, as far as we know, was never used for teaching teaching literacy. either for children or for rhetoricians. Homer was what you began with when you were a kid. And the first line you wrote was Homer was not a man, but a god. Now tell me if that Homer isn't everywhere in the Greco-Roman world.
Wow.
And Neil, you've got a clip from Tony Burke that might work at this point, actually.
Play it,
Oh
Neil.
yeah, perfect. Let's do it.
Like, there's so many scholars who
This is my
actually-
recent video that from yesterday from Professor Tony Burke from Toronto University. And sorry, Derry, say what you're
No,
saying.
I just wanted to say that people, like, there are academics, so many that I did not know about, who may not follow you all the way to the end of the yellow brick road, Dennis, but follow the yellow brick road. And they all say, hey, there's a wizard behind that curtain. We're not sure we agree with what the wizard looks like. We're not sure exactly what his voice is, but it's there. We agree with Dennis. It's there. And here is expert. This guy is genius. I mean, he has translated several pseudepigrapha writings.
Well, he's got 3 volumes of like dozens of texts. So yeah, it's
Christian Apocrypha.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
3
he's
volumes
awesome.
right now. There's countless amounts of text. And there's more coming too. But yeah. So yeah, let's play this clip of these apocryphal texts having connections.
It's got an
or
echo, Neil.
something drawing from Greco-Roman instead of
you
just
gotta mute
the
your
Hebrew
mic.
side that we always know that we okay.
So keep playing, but mute your mic. Let's see if that helps.
All know about.
For sure. Like, these are writers writing in Greek. So they're educated in Greek. They know at least some of their Greek classics, right? We have evidence of on papyrus and potsherds and stuff like that of school exercises where people would be copying out pieces of Homer. So people were educated on this. So we should expect to see references here and there or allusions to Greek classics texts. And yeah, Dennis MacDonald is classic for doing this. I think where he got his start with this was with the Acts of Andrew.
Yeah.
And so the Acts of Andrew is, again, one of these individual apocryphal acts. And there's another text somewhat related to it called the Acts of Andrew and Matthias, in which Andrew rescues Matthias from the hands of these cannibals in a place called Myrmidon, or Myrmidonia, I should say. And Dennis thinks the Acts of Andrew and Matthias was the lost beginning to the Acts of Andrew. So he reads them all together as one long text. And he's thinking, where does this idea of the Myrmidonians come from? And it comes from Homer, this land of cannibals. And so he sees the Acts of Andrew and Matthias all together with it as kind of a Christianization of Homer. And he has this long list of parallels between not only in the Odyssey and the Iliad, but some other Greek classics as well. And I think that there's really something to that with that particular text. I don't necessarily agree that the two texts were originally joined, but I do think it's quite reasonable to think that there could be parallels with Greek classics in there to make Andrew a Christian Odysseus, though without all the themes that the Christians may not be as attracted to.
You're muted, and it gets better. You're not.
I tend, though, to think that Dennis makes too much out of small things. Like, you'll see a word here and say, "Oh, this is evoking this," and then it makes a lot out of isolated words, which I think goes too far often. But the basic notion that writers of both canonical and non-canonical texts who write in Greek, who are writing primarily to Greek audiences, would know their Homer, would know their and some other classical texts. Another example you can bring in is the Apocalypse of Peter. Apocalypse of Peter is Jesus has come back from the dead, and he takes Peter on a tour of the underworld. And this is one of many tour of hell apocalypses, as we call them, tour of hell apocalypses. Paul is an apocalypse of Paul, which is very similar. Apocalypse of Mary, very similar. These tours of the underworld. And the underworld, the topography of the underworld is essentially the way the Greeks looked at it. You get rivers of fire. We sometimes get Charon, the guy who takes people across one of the rivers on his boat. We get the terminology Hades, Tartarus, all these other things. This is really drawn from Greek mythology, not Jewish depictions of the underworld. Though we don't really have any developed Jewish depictions of the underworld, but like we do in Greek literature. So certainly that's an adaptation of those ideas for a Christian audience. So I like Dennis very much. I like some of what he does, but I tend to see that sometimes he's like I said, making too much sometimes out of isolated words rather than convincing parallels.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I think he comments about also agreeing with you on seeing the death of Hector and Jesus, and there's some, but he might have mentioned that before this. Anyway, you can unmute. Yeah, either way, that was worth bringing up just to show, while these great scholars at least pat you on the back and see you on the right path, may not follow down to the very jot and tittle of comparison in your work, but they love your work and they see you're onto something.
And
let me
just say one thing real quick. And it's also a fair criticism. He knows it. He read it. He looked at it. He has his own opinion on it. He's not just dismissing it. So you got to respect that all right away.
Yep.
Thank you, Tony. I don't know if you're ever going to see this, but I actually agree with you about the little pieces. I hope that I correct myself by not thinking that the little asides, the same word for speaking or how many people were in a crowd or whatever, satisfy mimesis criticism. But one of my criteria is density. The issue is how many of those little things appear in the same way, in the same order. And so even things that are tiny cumulatively can contribute to the density. But of course, there's so much subjectivity in literary criticism in comparing these texts. And I'm the first person to acknowledge it. But I would say the subjectivity is the fun of it. That is the exploration, the use of the imagination, the appreciation that other people are creating eclectic pieces of literature to make sense of this nasty world. Thank you for the clip. But I think we should go back to our objections. Derek, if you could put that list back up.
Yep. So you've already addressed the idea that this devalues the influence of Jewish scripture.
Right. So let's have Neil read the next one, the Homeric epics.
The Homeric epics are not a generic or linguistic match for the Gospels.
But neither are the satires of Lucian or the majority of ancient imitations. Ancient mimesis was less interested in genre than it was in genetic connections of one text to another. So that you can have the satires of Lucian are written in prose, but they certainly are mimetic of the Homeric epics. It's quite clear. And so, and by the way, all Jewish imitations of Homer in their literature, or Euripides, who was just as popular among Jews, none of them is written in generic or archaic Greek. They're all written in prose, and what holds them together is characterization and motifs and plot elements. It is not linguistics, and it is not literary genre.
Thank you. The parallels between Mark and epics are inconsistent. Jesus resembles Telemachus, Odysseus, Hector, Aeolus, Circe.
The same thing's true all over the Aeneid. Sometimes Aeneas resembles Odysseus, sometimes it's Achilles, sometimes it could even be Heracles. So that kind of criticism is just feeble. They're reaching for, and by the way, this issue of eclecticism is extremely important. Many imitations are hybrids. They're using various literary tropes and models in order to create something new and beautiful. So they're not slaves to being consistent, that their characters are imitating only one character from Greek poetry.
And let me help add icing to the cake there, and that is the same can be said if you were not looking at the Greek. Look at what they do with Jesus just from scriptures. He's Elijah, he's Moses, he's multiple biblical characters, but no, he can only imitate one character. No, he's imitating several biblical characters.
Absolutely,
and better than all of them.
Yeah,
Such a good point. Such a good point. Your methodology is unfalsifiable because you treat differences as parallels.
This is such a stupid objection, and I'm going to say that Margaret Mitchell is the one who has advanced this, and then other people have picked up on it. Mimesis is not mimeographed imitation. It's agonistic. That is, it is trying to show that my hero is better than your hero. So when I say that the death of Hector is similar to the death of Jesus, and then one says, well, yeah, but one stays in the tomb and the other gets raised from the dead. My answer is, duh, of course. That's why they're imitating it, in order to show that Jesus is superior to the likes of Hector, who stays in his tomb. I mean, it goes on and on. So you could say that with Polyphemus, Jesus heals the Gerasene demoniac, whereas Odysseus blinds him. Well, that's a syncresis, or the Greeks would call it a zalesis. It's a rivalry. Yes, sometimes differences are parallels. The example I use is that a feminist friend of our family gave my young daughter a book called Sleeping Ugly. That's obviously a riff on Sleeping Beauty. But you can't say that ugly and beauty are not in some ways parallels, but they're agonistic parallels. And what you find in the Gospels is not plagiarism, but it's critical engagement with mythology. It's to say that Jesus isn't just like Odysseus. Jesus is better. He's more like Aeolus, who can calm the winds when Odysseus can't. I mean, it goes on and on. So this idea that parallels only are sympathetic is really nonsense when you think about how literature works.
More icing on the cake, Dennis. If we took that approach, then the consensus of Hebrew critical scholars would not say that Genesis is riffing off the Babylonian narratives, because it is actually doing the opposite. The ziggurat is bad rather than the pinnacle of society. It is the worst part of society. In fact,
that's a beautiful example.
Such a good idea.
Yes,
beautiful
we all
example.
know they're using that and competing against their Babylonian rulers, and their mythology is better. They're trying to say, no. Being the pastoral, being a shepherd, being a person who's out here, not civilization, is better.
Right.
That's wicked. This is righteous. And the Babylonians saying the most pinnacle part of righteousness is the peak of civilization. So it's the direct opposite.
That's brilliant. That's a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
And I think you can find analogies all over the place. The reason that you rewrite stories because you don't like them as much as that you do like them.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, with Marduk and Ninurta, it was they took to the story of Ninurta and said that god was great and all, but this god Marduk, he did everything Ninurta did, but more. He did it better. So
and take a look at the Aeneid. The Aeneid is rewriting Homer out of admiration, but his hero is superior to the likes of Greek heroes. It's just a stupid objection.
Yeah, well, that's one of my things I think is worth mentioning when we get there, is about the it is written controversy. Well, we know it's written. Does the Aeneid ever, just a quick response, I guess, from you, does the Aeneid ever tip its hat and say, oh, thanks, Homer, it is written over here in the Odyssey or the Iliad? Does it ever give mention of the material?
No, it doesn't, but it has the advantage of using proper nouns that appear in Homer. So instead of it is written, then you say Aeneas put in to the island of the Cyclopes. Well, that's a flag to what it is written, I suppose.
Okay, cool. You're next, I think, Neil.
Okay. Is that the next one? Your methodology does not conform to the literary conventions of ancient rhetoric.
That is bullshit. According to Tim Whitmarsh, George Kennedy, Thomas Rosenmeyer, and other authorities on ancient rhetoric, this is precisely how they learn to write. You have the Quintilian's Institutes of Rhetoric, and he teaches students that when they start to learn how to write, they start with Homer and Virgil. If they want to write a history, then they go to Herodotus or Livy. If they want to know rhetoric, then they can use Demosthenes or Cicero. So they have models that they use to compose. So mimesis in the New Testament is precisely what people learn to write in school. That's how they learn to write. And the primary, according to Quintilian, you start by imitating Homer.
Thank you. No one in history of reception have seen these imitations, Dennis.
That is blind. What about Justin Martyr or Clement of Alexandria and the Protrepticus, the Homeric centos beginning in the 4th century, extending at least until the 9th, retell gospel stories by using from Homer the very lines that inspired it in the first place. I can give several examples, and in my synopses, I give my own translation of several hundred lines of the centos. A medieval Gospel of Nicodemus sees in the gospel accounts of the death of Jesus, the death of Hector, and he uses independently, he uses the Iliad to fill in the gaps in the biblical narrative. So, of course, people saw it. Now, of course, most readers did not. And these readers I'm talking about are all educated Greeks. When the Christian movement moves into a Roman environment and Greek is no longer what they're taught, they can't see the similarities because they don't know the antecedents. And by the way, that's true of most modern biblical scholars. They don't see the parallels because they don't know Homer either. And reading Homeric Greek is hard. It took me a decade to learn how to read the Homeric Greek comfortably.
Wow. Well, Dennis, we went through some of these kind of criticisms. There's a few academics in particular that have been brought up in the recent post that Jonathan McClatchy was trying to jab at you and say your work is silly. He didn't even go so far as to list academics who disagree. But in the comment section, once I commented, people were like, actually, because I was like, there hasn't been much engagement with your work like there should be. And I've known 4 or 5 people in history who've tried to kind of be critical of your work. One of them is Litwa. We've had Litwa on the channel. And Litwa thinks that it's just in the oxygen, that it's just kind of in the air. And you've done an episode with me and Litwa on this. And in fact, you were amening to what Litwa was saying in several places. But your whole critique is, sorry, there's a lot more going through the medium of literature than what he's granting. He's assuming it's on the street corner, it's at the plays, it's kind of just in the air. That's where the stuff's coming from. Whereas you're saying, why wouldn't we factor in the actual literary component to this? Because in order to learn Greek, to become someone who publishes books in Greek, like we have the Gospels, you had to saturate yourself with the Homeric epics and would have known these narratives, which would have helped you formulate your stories if you were going to write a good story in Greek.
No, that's right. Yeah. There was another place where I thought we could benefit from.
In the text?
Did we do display number 1 already?
Yes, we did one. One was about the denial, suppression, accommodation, methodological assaults, and marginalization.
Yeah.
We did display
okay.
2, at least going through those examples. Display 3 is in response to this chain of logic. I would give one of my own, which re-articulates the 7 criteria at the core of mimesis criticism.
Let's scroll back a little bit. Let's take a look at display 2.
Okay. Display 1, display 2. Okay.
There you go. Here's what I think the dialectic is of my opponents in trying to protect biblical, the matrix of traditional biblical scholarship. And I'm going to ask Neil to read those, to join us, I guess, in reading those dots. So I'll do the first one, and then Derek, I'll have you, and then Neil.
Okay.
And we'll see how this works. So in sum, my critics would say the literary parallels between Greek poetry and the Gospels do not exist. That is denial.
Neil?
Since they do not exist, one may ignore and silence those who say they do. Suppression.
If they do exist, they are not mimetically intertextual, but dynamically intercultural. Accommodation, Litwa.
Oh, that's Litwa. Exactly. Even if they were, Neil, are you the next one? Or
sure.
Anyway,
I thought Dennis.
Yeah, even if they were intertextually mimetic, no criteria can demonstrate it. That's methodological assaults.
Even if one were to prove that some are mimetic, they are insignificant blips on the radar. That's called marginalization.
The matrix survives largely unscathed. Whoo!
Okay, now, so that's how it goes. There are no parallels. Well, maybe there are, but we can't prove them. Okay, if they are, we can accommodate them in traditional scholarship. But we don't like the methodology that MacDonald uses to deal with it. And even if he's right about a few, it's just a blip on the radar. So let's go on and ignore it all. But here's my response to it. And I think this is the core of what I want to say today. And if you want to interrupt me at the end of every bullet item, I'd welcome that. The first one is, no models for literary culture were more popular in the early Roman Empire than the Homeric epics. As Quintilian put it to his students, quote, "The proper place for us to begin is with Homer. Like his own ocean, which he says is the source of every spring, river and spring, Homer provides the model and the origin of every department of eloquence." And I would include the Gospels there. At stake here, then, is the satisfaction of criterion 1 of mimesis criticism, accessibility. No literature was more influential in education and in Greek society than the Homeric epics. Yeah. And to say that the Gospels are not living in that world is, in my view, ignorance.
And also both during the Nero era, where you have writers like Martial, and Martial, that's later, Domitian, but then you have during Nero's time, you have like Lucan. You have those type of writers. They're writing they're taking Homer and writing their own stuff based on the Homeric stuff. That makes sense. It's already going on. You don't need the Gospels to prove it. We already see it in other texts.
And Jews are doing it. You have it in Josephus.
Right.
Okay, Derek, how about you reading the next one? Mimesis stood at the center.
Mimesis stood at the center of literary education and production. The dominant notion in the literary aesthetic among Greek intellectuals in the early Roman Empire was mimesis. Philodemus, who would claim that the writing of prose is not reliant on the Homeric poems. At stake here is the satisfaction of criterion 2 of mimesis criticism, analogy.
So if I could paraphrase Philodemus, it's most New Testament scholars who would claim that the writing of prose is not reliant on Homeric poems. This goes back to the issue of whether the Homeric epics or the Greek poetry is aligned as an appropriate generic or linguistic analogy to the Gospels. That's not how it works with mimesis. Mimesis crosses over genre. So here, prose is dependent on Homeric poetry, and Quintilian and Philodemus know it.
Thank you.
Okay, Neil, how about the Gospels and Acts?
The Gospels and Acts are populated by analogs to Homeric characters and episodes that are so profuse, sequential, and unusual that they must not be ignored. At stake here is the satisfaction of criteria 3 through 5 of mimesis criticism: density, order, and distinctive traits.
Now, at some point, we may want to talk about the Eurycleia episode in the washing of Jesus's feet, or
That's Neil's favorite.
It is my favorite.
Or the Gerasene demoniac, which Derek tends to like. And for me, it's the death of Jesus as the death of Hector, and so on. So, I think, gentlemen, you would both agree with me that in those cases, the parallels are dense, sequential, and distinctive.
And the sequential is like the sequential part. You can't, the in the air argument doesn't work for that.
Right, you can't.
Things that are in the air, they don't line up sequentially. There's no.
That's exactly right.
You can't do that's impossible. The odds of that happening are one in a million. Like it's in the air. So I accidentally counted the same amount of numbers that Derek counted over there. Like that doesn't work that way. It's the sequence thing. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, that's brilliant comment. But also, we know how many copies there were of the Homeric epics, that people were schooled on them. Litwa provides parallels that are in the air. In some cases, we only have one manuscript of them, and often from a different geographical or temporal context. So which of those two are you going to favor as the model for, or the antecedent in the inspiration for a text? By the way, I love the word inspiration. It's not inspired by the Holy Spirit or by God. It's inspired by other genius literature. So I believe that in my own work, I have a sense of transcendence and inspiration. Inspiration's a powerful word, but where does it come from? I think it comes from the creative spirit of creativity and imagination. Derek, how about the next one, the imitations? Yeah.
The imitations of classical Greek literature also are interpretable, criterion 6. Mimesis enabled constructing one's own self-representation through and against the canonical past. The literature of Rome and Greece engages dynamically with inherited images, tropes, and identities, actively constructing a new way of looking at the world. By imitating classical Greek poetry, the synoptic evangelists constructed their own new ways of looking at the world.
And they weren't trying to hoodwink their readers. They were trying to inspire their readers with a different form of the foundation mythology that would allow for a certain kind of cohesiveness in their social in-group. So this is not simply plagiarism. This is social foundationalism. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah,
I think what happens all too often, Dennis, in the online polemics is the skeptic who doesn't believe wants to say that's plagiarism. Now, at this time, I guess if you really did like copy directly everything and didn't combat it or find an eloquent way of reversing it or whatnot, then maybe they would have charged you of that.
They would have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But because there was some clever, ingenious way of turning it and using it in your own stew, it's like an ingredient. Then that charge, we need to stop throwing the charge out there like that. But I know why it's being thrown out there, because there's zero recognition, if anything, absolute denial on anything going on. So sometimes you overreach to try and get others to see it and go, they're copying, they're borrowing, they're this, and they are in a way. But the charge of trying to assume they just stole it or something like that, it's better to be more sophisticated and educated in that kind of response. But it's hard when you're dealing with knuckleheads who ignore and deny that anything's happening.
I just want to say real quick. I just want to say something. The social situation that you were mentioning, the foundation, we're talking about the century, right, that followed Virgil, that followed Ovid. And the thing of the time period was repurposing ancient
That's
popular
exactly
texts,
right.
especially
That's right.
Ovid with the Metamorphosis, where he's looking at the myths from Cyprus about Aphrodite and Adonis, and he's looking at the Phrygian myths. He's looking at all these myths over here, and he's putting it all in one place. And then obviously we already talked about the Aeneid, taking all the Homeric stuff and putting it in the Latin. Like, this is the thing that's happening in that time.
That's right, and it happens in our time too.
Right.
And think of the way that movies spin off of, let's say, James Bond, in order to have a spoof of the James Bond movie, or the James Bond movie spoofing on themselves. So that's art. That's exactly what it is. It's art. It's not plagiarism.
Thank you, Dennis.
So, Neil, I guess it's your turn to read some of the imitations.
Some of the imitations of Homer identified in SETG,
Synopsis of Epic Tragedy in the Gospels.
Thank you. Were recognized by later Christian authors. Criterion 7, ancient recognitions.
Yeah, and that's what I meant by the Homeric Gentones and the Clement of Alexandria and so on. And the final one, Derek?
By resisting Mimesis criticism as one of many methodologies needed to interpret the synoptics, the disciplinary matrix we call New Testament scholarship is turning a blind eye to one of the most important aspects of their composition.
That's, I think, enough. I think we can invite people to chat about this, or you can add some examples to it. I also have a final paragraph that I could read to you. That is my laying down the gauntlet against to my critics in the academy. We could save that, or I could read it now, or I really have said what I wanted to say.
Okay.
And so it's time, I think, either to wrap it up or to take some questions.
Well, I know that you have, this is the specific example of the death of Hector and the death of Jesus, correct?
Yeah.
So you brought up that example.
The Eutychus one's great too. If you had that.
Well, he has. By the way, I might as well make a plug here. I've mentioned this before. If you haven't taken the course, the 18 lecture course with Dennis on showing mimesis criticism and the examples, we go into the Eutychus, we go into Hector's death, we go into the Gerasim demoniac, Circe, and of course the Polyphemus Cyclops. We go into John the Baptist and the beheading of Agamemnon. We go into, there are so many examples that when you walk away, some of that spaghetti's bound to stick on the wall. There's just no way you're not going to get something from this and go, is he making up all of it? Good luck trying to show Dennis is just making up all of this. And that's my little plug. And so the book that I've pinned at the top, if you haven't got the book, you really should get it, because even the course just scratches the surface. Sure, we go and try and find what we think are the strongest, but there are several we had to skip. Me and Dennis were like, we don't have as much time as we thought we were going to have, and this is already becoming very long in terms of the course. But you go through the entire Gospels. You have them paralleled next to each other. You even have hypothetical Q in here. You go into several things here, Dennis, that I can't wait to actually do videos on. Even Acts. Recently, I've been diving into Acts. I just did a video, launched it on Patreon yesterday, doing Purbo's book on the mystery of Acts, unraveling its story. And in your book, Synopses of Epic, you go in, was it volume 2?
Yes, right.
Synthesis? Yeah, volume 2 on the Acts. And I want to go through those. There's like 20 examples, you said, from Acts going back into the Greek literature, the Euripides, Aeneid, even the Odyssey, Iliad, etc. So endless stuff to go over here. Is there anything else? Because I mean, Neil, you may want to get into some examples. I was thinking we could do the super chats at the end when we're done going through a few examples.
It's up to you, Derek.
Well, I want Dennis to make that decision.
Well, I think the advantage of looking at the death of Hector is that we have the visual that we can look at.
Okay.
And I don't think it would take long.
No.
And let's see, that begins with I guess it's display 4. And I don't know how we want to do this. Maybe
we'll let Neil can read the first Mark passages there. So let him and you go all the way down.
Sure.
All right. So and Derek, we'll pick you up at the break.
Got it.
Okay. All right. So you could scroll. There we go. This is Iliad 22. Again, this is not just the most popular book that we have in Greek-speaking Roman Empire, but it's also one of the very best-known stories of it.
Sure. And real quick, before we do this, I just want people to keep in mind the sequence of events. Keep tabs on the sequence of how these things are playing out. That's all.
Okay, that's great. Hector's troops fled into the city for safety, leaving him to face his fate alone.
Jesus' disciples fled for safety, leaving him to face his fate alone.
Zeus passed judgment. Hector must die.
Pilate passed judgment. Jesus must die. By the way, Pilate is a seat in for the state of Rome, which is basically the Kyrios, the Lord, the ruler. So there you go.
In book 6, Hector had refused mixed wine offered him to relieve his pain.
Jesus refused mixed wine offered him to relieve his pain.
Achilles and Hector traded taunts.
Various hostile groups taunted Jesus.
Hector called to Deiphobus for help, but he never came.
The bystanders thought Jesus was calling to Elijah for help, but he never came.
Hector then knew that he would be killed, for his gods had abandoned him.
Jesus then knew that he would be killed and lamented, that his God had abandoned him.
Now, let's read that one again. Hector then knew that he would be killed, for his gods, Apollo and Zeus, had abandoned him.
Jesus then knew that he would be killed and lamented that his God had abandoned him.
Now, in order to make that claim, which is so important to Mark and not to the other Gospels,
right?
He has an example of mimetic hybridity. It's actually a quotation of Psalm 22, but it has a narrative analogy in the Iliad. It's a brilliant example of mimetic hybridity.
And by the way, that sabakathoni, that word has that kathoni in there. So I don't know. Let's fair enough. We'll talk about that later. But go ahead.
Okay. Hector's soul went to Hades with a shout.
Jesus then knew that he would be killed. I'm sorry. Let me read that again. Jesus uttered a loud shout and expired.
Before Hector died, he predicted Achilles' death as divine punishment for his violence against him. Trojans mourned him as though their city had been destroyed from top to bottom.
Jesus' death anticipated the fall of Jerusalem and the temple, whose curtain was rent from top to bottom.
Achilles.
Can I make a comment on that? Just an emphasis. It must be emphasized that Hector's death implied the death of Troy as a city. Jesus' death implied the death of Jerusalem.
Dude, you don't even know how profound that is, what you just said. That is so spot on. That is spot on. Yeah.
And that's why I think Mark chose the death of Hector.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to make the death of Jesus connected to the destruction of Jerusalem. I think that's so important to emphasize. But let's go on. Achilles gloated that he had just slain the one Trojans considered a god.
The centurion gloated that he had just executed a bogus son of God.
The women of Troy, watching Hector's death from their walls, cried laments. There are three of them: Andromache, Hecuba, and Helen.
3 women, the same number, watched Jesus' death from afar and presumably lamented. They included Mary of Tower Town.
But see, if I were a Christian apologist, I'd say, well, everything that happened on the right-hand side happened just that way. And it was just, happenstance that you had something similar in the Iliad, or God already inspired the Iliad as an anticipation of the death of Jesus. And both of those solutions are obviously silly, if I could use an apologist's word. So, yeah.
Can I emphasize again, this is an important point, and I can put myself in the shoes of people who it might be impressive to them, but you're so used to mowing through your mimesis here that these powerful points we have to repeat to remind people. The women of Troy, watching Hector's death from their walls, cried laments. There's 3 women. Was it Andromache? What is this?
Andromache. And Hecuba and Helen, yeah.
She's in a tower, you said.
Yeah,
she's in a tower watching Hector die.
The Pergamum, yeah.
3 women watched Jesus' death from afar and presumably lamented. They include Mary Magdalene, Magdalene is Tower Town, woman from Tower Town. Right. So you have this really interesting 3 women watching the death of their hero, that if they die, the temple, their city's destroyed, and they're lamenting his death. And one is literally in a tower, and the other one is a Mary of Tower Town. I have to emphasize that.
Yeah, good for you. Okay, Derek, let's...
real quick. Now that you mentioned that, though, I just want to say something real quick, because if you go up to the part where it talks about him lamenting for his God, that word sabachthoni, it almost, if you're like, because the Mary the Tower thing pun, I'm arguing this might be new to both of you right now, but someone who's teaching me a Greek pointed this out, and I think they might be on something. That might be a pun. That might be a pun for Hades. Chthoni is a title for the underworld god.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, Chthonian deities.
That makes you look on the other side. You got Hades with a shout.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that you might even be under. You might be going under what your score.
Well, and we also know that there's a wordplay, because Eloi is interpreted by the people around as a call for Elijah. So the fact that you have this semantic density of wordplay.
That's what I'm saying. There's something going on with that Eloi Sabachthoni. I think there's a pun happening there.
That could very well be.
And then the what does it say? The temple splits or whatever, the curtain. So yeah, something's going on with that. But anyway.
Derek, Neil, I have a question for you.
Sure.
And Derek too. I'll give it the question. Isn't this way of reading the Gospels more fun?
Absolutely.
I think so.
This is also why I love learning Greek, because I can make theories like that and throw it at scholars like you, MacDonald. but
it challenges your imagination, and the issue is not who's right or wrong, but who has the most beautiful and compelling interpretation of the cleverness of these authors and these texts. So I think when you make those judgments, Neil, you're being inspired to do so in a way.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. I think it's you and me, Derek, on the next ones. Priam, king of Troy, set out at night to rescue the body of his son Hector from his murderer Achilles.
When it was late, Joseph of Arimathea, a distinguished member of the council who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God.
The journey was dangerous. He had entered Achilles' abode and asked for the body of Hector.
Dared to go to Pilate and ask for the body of Jesus.
Achilles was amazed that Priam dared to enter his home.
Then Pilate was amazed that he might already be dead, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time.
Yeah, those don't look very similar, but even your viewers should be able to see the similarities in the language. Etles and tlea and tolmasas. They're the same root basically in Greek of daring to go to someone. And we're going to see that just as Pilate summons the centurion, we have the summoning of servants later in the Iliad. Okay, Achilles granted Hector's body. Hector's body had been saved from desecration.
A hasty burial saved his body from desecration.
Achilles granted Hector's body to his father.
When we learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph.
Then the maidservants washed and anointed his body with oil and wrapped it in a beautiful cape and tunic, and Achilles himself lifted it and placed it upon a bier.
And having bought a linen shroud and taken him down, he wrapped him in a linen shroud and placed him in a tomb that had been cut out of rock.
The Trojans took the bones and placed them in a golden chest and covered it with soft purple robes. Immediately then they placed it in a hollow ditch and heaped large stones over it.
And he rolled a stone at the door of the tomb.
Earlier, Achilles' maidservants had washed and anointed Hector.
Earlier, a woman had anointed Jesus for his burial.
And
Now,
of course, the difference is Hector stays in his tomb and Jesus rises from it. But both we anticipate the fall of a city.
So, couple things just put in my highlighter on. Catch the things I don't get, Dennis, that you want to emphasize. But Hector, the hero of the city of Troy, dies. That's the doom of the city of Troy. Jesus, the hero of Jerusalem, dies. The doom of the city of Jerusalem is taking place here. And then you have Priam, the father of Hector. At night, he has the courage to, in a crazy situation, to try and go and get the body of his son from Achilles, which means a good chance you're going to get killed. This guy's not a good guy. In the gospel narrative, at least in Mark, because I think they're kind of whitewashing Roman stuff over time. But in Mark, Josephus has the guts to go, or not Josephus, Joseph of Arimathea goes and has the guts to get the body of Jesus from Pontius Pilate, just like Priam has the guts. Interesting note, Priam's the father of Hector. Joseph is the name of the father of Jesus, but it isn't his actual father, as far as we can tell, Joseph of Arimathea, but it might be a play on the word or the name there, that a guy who has the same name of his father is going with guts to go up to this guy that is not a good dude.
They're both being saved from a shameful death to a honorable death, to an honorable burial. So there's a similarity there.
Yeah.
And
one more thing about Derek's comment, and then I'll be quiet for a bit. Of course, Mary of Nazareth is not the one who anoints her son after he has an early death. It's two other Marys, right? Just as you have Joseph as the name of the father playing the role of Priam, it's two other Marys, and one of the Marys has two boys that have the same names as Jesus's brother. The Markan evangelist is saying, catch on. It's not the family of Jesus that cares for him. It's those who are doing the will of God in their theology.
That's a good point. Also, I want to. If you saw the movie Troy, the Brad Pitt movie,
yeah, sure,
that is not going to do you no justice to how central the death of Hector is.
Mm-hmm.
In the
That's right.
text, when you read like I don't read it, the translation, because I'm not like fluent. I can't like read ancient Greek. But the text that I have, it does a good job of highlighting how important, how central the death of Hector is to the Iliad. It's the biggest part of the whole entire story.
In fact, the Aeneid ends with an imitation of the death of Hector with the death of Turnus. And instead of the death of a city, you have the founding of a city, namely Rome now can represent a merging of the two peoples. That's how the Acts of the Apostles ends, with Paul in Rome allowing for the merging of Jews and believers into the kingdom of God. I mean, this play goes on, and unless you see the Homeric and the poetic background, you don't understand what's going on in the text.
Yeah.
You just don't.
This is the last thing I want to say about this, because this is undeniable. Central to Christianity is the death and resurrection of Jesus. Central to the Iliad is the death of Hector and the mourning of the king, and Achilles giving the body back over. There's something central to that text, that this is so central to that text. But the thing I wanted to say to like Christians that might be like, whoa, I think if anything, if Christians own this would make their religion more impenetrable. Like you have a universal religion that's drawing from all the ancient rites, and you don't want, like, you want to like hide from that. Like it makes your book way better, in my opinion. I'm just saying.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but you know how that one plays out. I mean, there's something unique in their ideology about we have the truth, no one else has it, you know, that kind of thing, rather than playing fair on the playground and everybody can have their toys and we have our toys too. They need to have the special toys. And that's why I played that Dan Barker basement video before we started, because I'm actually going to launch that short. And he's like, imagine walking down the street. And I said, hey, you're walking by and I go, hey, listen, I've got good news. And you're like, what? Listen, you don't have to go down into my basement. And looking at you like, well, what are you talking about? You don't have to go down into my basement. He's like, yeah. Listen, I sometimes I get really angry. People come and follow me. And so I created this torture chamber down in my basement with knives and fire and all sorts of stuff, because I'm really, really upset that people aren't listening and following me, but you don't have to worry about that anymore. Why do I not have to worry about that anymore? I sent my son down there. And so his blood was spilled and I tortured him. So now you can believe in my son, and we can go live in my attic. How does that sound? You can tell me how good I am.
No, that's a brilliant analogy. I want to go back to Neil's point though, because I really don't, I think it is important. When I begin my classes, and I haven't been in the classroom for 10 years now, but I would often begin my classes with clips from the Bill Moyer's conversations with Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell was the scholar who wrote the Here with a Thousand Faces. He was a Jungian and used Jungian theory to talk about the universality of mythologies. And that's a very important thing to consider, that you have world religions and world mythologies that have analogies with each other, and they have similar psychological functions. Folklorists, though, have been suspicious of Joseph Campbell's work, because the differences between the manifestations of these stories often are more important than their similarities. But the question that I give my students around Easter time is it for you, the resurrection of Jesus, important because he was the only person raised from the dead? Or is it important because it's the Christian variation of the victory of life over death and a sense of immortality? And I think the problem with Christian apologists is that they want to make such special claims for their religion without understanding that their religion is a riff on other kinds of mythologies. Now, this is not mimesis. This is more of the history of religions. It's more the kind of thing that I think Neil has been fascinated by with the common mythologies. But I think this is a basic turning point in how we understand things. And I think it's a big difference between David Litwa and myself, by the way, that I think Litwa is more oriented toward the Greek manifestations of the hero with 1,000 faces, where you have that reoccurring in Christian texts. And I would say that, yes, you can have that, but the Christians are really riffing off of Homeric expressions of the same universals. But I think this tension between the universal and the sociologically and historically distinctive is a fascinating problem. And Neil, I think it would be interesting for you to have scholars on both sides of that issue work at a common mythology to say, is this a universal phenomenon, or what makes it sociologically and historically distinctive?
Okay, I'd like to get to some of these super chats if we can.
Yeah, good.
Let's do it.
So I'm hoping, my goal is to have sincere question, comments, critiques, anything you want to ask. As long as you're respectful, I'm totally fine with that. You can be triggered, but just be respectful. I don't mind. But yeah, so scrolling back up to the tippy, we have some great people in here. Let's go this way, Neil. We're gonna have all three of us equally on the screen here. Some great people in the chat. Hit that like button. And before we start, you gotta get a copy. Right now, I looked on Amazon, Dennis. It's going for $29, paperback, and this is solid. This is a big book. So
you got everything all in one spot.
Goodness gracious, it's so there's all sorts of good stuff in here. He even has some visuals in here from time to time. But you got to get you a copy of this. It's great. Okay, there's my shameless plug. It's pinned at the top. Super chats. Let's see. I hope, fingers crossed, close my eyes. I hope that we can get some Christian apologists in here who have questions. Super chat your questions. Challenge. What's up? Bring it. Bring it. Gloves are off. Dennis isn't playing games. Brave New History, thank you for the super chat. How could we run a data analysis to objectively test mimesis?
I actually think there are ways to do it, but I think basically the spotting of mimesis is subjective, just as the reading of literature generally is. One way more objectively to identify it, though, let's say that you have an overlapping term in the Homeric epics, and you have another one that is similar or identical in the Gospels. You can run data analysis to find out how unusual that connection is. Or you may have a string of motifs, and you could then do an objective assessment of how often those motifs appear in that same sequence in ancient literature. So I actually think there is a place for science and for data crunching in mimesis. In the long term, though, I think it has more to do with imagination, and that's always difficult to demonstrate analytically. But I do think we can be more creative in seeing how unusual some of these materials are that link things together.
Thank you, Brave New History. I skipped one. Sorry. Scott Daniel says, Chat GPT wrote the Gospels. Problem solved. Thank you, Scott. Nitty says, you can see the mimesis technique used in martyrdom accounts of the first apostles. They borrow from the Gospels to tell a new story of the apostles. All you have to do is read them with your brain on.
Nitty, you're exactly right. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Why is it that Peter is crucified upside down? then you have Andrew crucified on a cross at the edge of the sea, tied to it but not nailed to it, because it's like Odysseus at the mast. So the Gospels themselves become targets of mimesis. There's no doubt about it.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Nitty. Christine Elise, thank you so much for the super chat. 3 awesome people. Thanks for the discussion. I rarely paid attention in my comparative mythology classes, but I can't put down Dr. MacDonald's books.
Nice.
Oh my God. Great. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christine. I really appreciate the support. Imnag with the super sticker. Really appreciate you, Imnag. And to give the thumbs up. Wanting to make sure I didn't miss you there. I know you sometimes will drop comments. Okay, I cannot pronounce because I do not read it. You think the Quran does mimesis?
I wish I were more of a scholar of the Quran. And when I have tried to work with the Quran, I found that I was not intellectually capable of understanding the complexities of it. So I'm going to have to listen to humanists, to our authorities on the Quran. I do know that there is rewriting of Jewish and Christian literature in the Quran.
Right.
Now, whether that qualifies as mimesis or more of Haggadic or Midrashic reprise, I'm not so sure. So actually, this is a fascinating question, though. That is, we have all kinds of different intertextualities going on. Mimesis is just one. Another is redaction. Another is midrash. So I would expect that Muslims created their own forms of intertextuality that may be a hybrid of various models. But your question is very important. I just wish I were more an authority on it.
You know what? I think the closest thing that I could say about that is the dual Qarnayn thing, where you have a character in the Quran whose name's Dual Qarnayn, which means two-horned one, and he builds a wall between 2 mountains, and he erects a barrier to keep out Gog and Magog from invading the lands of civilized people. In the Greek Alexander romance, Alexander, who has horns on the coin,
there you go. That's right.
builds a wall between 2 mountains to keep out Gog and Magog.
Yeah, that's a good example.
And we know the Greek Alexander romance was translated into Syriac, so we know there was, and maybe Arabic too. I'm not sure, but I know
I have an academic on that actually did he's an expert on the Quran who actually showed that this author is aware of the Alexander romance, and this is where they got it. Gettysburg Demoniac, regarding Mimesis' criticism of the Gospels and Homeric epics, what problems does this pose for the historicity of the Synoptic Gospels?
I don't know who the Gettysburg Demoniac is, but it's not a diabolical question. It's a very good one. I'm going to go out on a limb, and it's not unusual for me to do so. I think apart from what the authors of the Gospels could have inherited from the Q document, and in some cases from a knowledge of Paul, certainly Luke knew Paul's career and letters, I don't think there's very much that the authors of the Synoptic Gospels knew about Jesus at all. I don't think there's a robust oral tradition that is independently informing them. Now, I'd love to have several sessions, maybe even a whole class on reconstructing the Lost Gospel Q. But I want to say my Q is not the Q that you know from other scholars. And my Q is longer, it's built on different criteria, and it offers a new solution to the synoptic problem generally. And, Mr. Gettysburg, it also allows for a new understanding of the historical lameness of the synoptic gospels. Now, after all, they weren't interested in writing history. They were writing historical fictions in order to give insight to the communities of their readers. But I think it has, if mimesis criticism is right, it does challenge the historicity of the Gospels. Now, I want to have one caveat on what I just said. A literary judgment is not the same as a historical judgment. So I can make a claim, for example, that Judas Iscariot never existed on the basis of his being like Melanthius in the Odyssey. But of course, that judgment is a literary judgment. It's not necessarily a historical judgment. Yes, there could be a Judas Iscariot. And I'm not in a position to know that. What I would say is that all of the evidence we have for Judas Iscariot points to Melanthius. I'd say the same thing of Mary Magdalene or Joseph of Arimathea. And I can understand why Christians who are fascinated by the depictions of their mythologies wish to say that there were characters who, in fact, were called Judas and were called Mary Magdalene and so on. That's okay. What I would say, you don't have, though, very good historical or literary evidence for their existence.
And can I add something to this? That is, suppose there is a literary mimetic thing happening. And let's go with one that isn't in your vein, one that is accepted, almost ubiquitous across critical scholarship and New Testament studies. That is, let's just say Matthew, because Matthew, the next super chat's going to address this too, and you'll get to dive into it. But like Matthew's mimetically comparing Jesus and Moses, but Jesus is the new lawgiver and he's much better than Moses, etc. The question then becomes, all right, while he's drawing on this character from the Hebrew scriptures, the Septuagint, to paint Jesus as a better Moses, like at what point can you say, when you know that he's doing this with purposeful literary intent, what Jesus actually historically did or didn't? So this is my problem when I've talked to Dr. Allison, Dale C. Allison Jr., who does his memory studies. He argues something has a memory behind it and something doesn't have a memory behind it. He talked about the 40 days in the wilderness temptation and fasting of Jesus. And he said, well, I think that this story is simply trying to say Jesus was an exorcist. That's about as much memory as he pulls from that. He thinks that. For me, I get it. I'm like, okay, it's interesting to hear it. But like, there's no way to ascertain any historical verification or validation from these narratives when they have a literary intention. You can assume, you could say, well, maybe that's also historically reliable. Go for it, but I don't know how it's even possible.
That's right. Yeah, and that's true over and over and over again.
Yeah, and that's something that I just keep nailing down. Like, I don't see how we're dying on the hill of confidence that this actually happened when we see very good reason in literary. There's creativity, it's imagination. This is not what seems to be literally happening.
Right.
Anyway, Gettysburg Demoniac's back again, says, does Matthew incorporate Homeric parallels like the other Gospels, or is his connection mostly to the Hebrew Bible?
Gettysburg, thank you again. Of course, his commitments are mostly to the Hebrew Bible. There's no doubt about it. But there's one, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because there's one passage where Matthew adds to the death narrative of Jesus and has an independent imitation of the Iliad. In other words, Matthew knows what Mark has done. Matthew knows that Mark has imitated the Iliad. How can we say that? Only in Matthew do we have guards at the tomb. And it's the sealed rock. And an angelos comes down and rolls away the stone and is in glory. And the guards become like dead men. They can't do anything. Now, what happens when Priam goes to rescue the body of his son? The guards are put to sleep. And the heavy bolt that is at Achilles' bivouac is thrown open because of Hermes. And Hermes is called in Greek an angelos. He's an angel. And so then the guards are still asleep, so that Hermes, the angelos, can lead Priam and his herald, Idaeus, safely out with the body of Hector. Matthew knows what Mark has done, and he adds his own Homeric imitation. Now, criterion 7 of mimesis criticism is ancient recognition of this mimesis. Matthew recognizes it, and by the way, so did Luke, because Luke adds his own parallels from the Iliad. Now, you can't explain that kind of density of mimesis of the same book of the Iliad without appealing to direct, conscious, and creative literary imitation. I'm sorry.
Can I highlight that again? I want to like put that into Derek Lambert dumb terms, okay? And that is, in the Iliad, you have Hermes that's being sent by Zeus to go and help get Priam to the body where Achilles has the body. So what does Hermes do? He puts all of the soldiers, what are at the tomb of Matthew? Soldiers, Roman soldiers, to sleep. Roll away the stone. Jesus escapes the tomb. They get the body. In Priam's case, Achilles is shocked that Priam shows up. How did you get here? A god must have helped you get. Oh, yeah. So Priam flies. By the way, that's another thing. Priam has wings, or it seems, not Priam, sorry, Hermes flies. Hermes flies, and he gets there, and he helps him get the body from Achilles. So there's something here. And it seems interesting, the connection you're making on that. Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that.
A very good question.
Hermes is an angelos. He's the messenger.
Yep, that's right.
Yep. Interesting point, Neil. Thank you, Gettysburg. Do the parallels in the Homeric epics provide insight to the original motivation for the writing the Gospels, or for writing the Gospels?
Oh, absolutely. Now, not for the writing of the Q document, but for the writing of Mark. And the reason that we can say that is that so many of the imitations that one finds in Mark and later in Luke have parallels in Virgil's Aeneid. Of the same passages in Homer that Virgil almost a century earlier had imitated, now are imitated also in the Gospels. Now, Mark is writing after the Jewish War, and he is not fond of Roman power. And in fact, it's Jesus was crucified after all, and the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and many of the followers of Jesus no doubt died in that carnage as well. So he is trying to say this is competitive mimesis. They're targeting the same passages in Greek poetry, but the accounts of Jesus show him to be superior, not just to Jewish heroes, but also to Aeneas. And the God of Jesus is more compassionate than the likes of Jupiter and Venus and Apollo and so on. So I think your question is right on target. We need to see that the writing of mimesis in Mark is competitive with Virgil as a part of his social struggle to give place to, not just place to the Jewish community, but to help them understand their situation after the war.
Thank you so much. Gettysburg, Demoniac, do most non-canonical Gospels have similar parallels, themes to Homeric epics?
No, but they are in the apocryphal Acts of Apostles. For the most part, the so-called non-canonical Gospels simply parrot the Gospels themselves without independent imitations of Greek poetry.
And you, just to point out, in non-canonical material, that was where you first discovered some of this.
The Acts of Andrew, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you. Imnag, thank you again for the support. I greatly appreciate your work. Not that I'm looking for talking points when confronting my fundamentalist family, but it sure helps to know that you're speaking on points that can be proven by literature and actual history.
Well, I'm so glad it's helpful to you.
Thank you, Imnag. Appreciate that. Joe Medley, really appreciate that. Joe, did you have anything for me?
Just so you know, Joe, for doing that super chat, Hermes is going to fly to your house next.
That's right. That's right. I'm scrolling down here. Oh, Imnag again. Dr. MacDonald, thank you. Always wanted to pair all these stories in real time to their true origins. I can't tell you how this is helping me personally.
You know, it helps me too. I was a fundamentalist. I'm a graduate of Bob Jones University. I planned to be a Christian minister or missionary, as was my father. And when I became more socially aware because of the civil rights movement and because of the war in Vietnam at the time, and then the dangers of capitalism and what we're doing to the world. Yes, I'm woke, but I'd rather be woke than asleep.
Ooh,
okay?
Somebody
and,
clip that.
It's having a way of understanding. By the way, after Bob Jones and before going to Princeton for a seminary, I translated the whole Greek New Testament for myself. I have my own translation that I did when I was 22.
Whoa.
And in reading that, I became aware of the moral horizon of early Christians. And I knew that if I were to stay a Christian, I would have to be a different kind of Christian and try to find a way to carry on the moral sensitivities of compassion, of inclusion, of caring that I saw in the New Testament. Now, I'm an atheist now, but that was a very important transition for me from fundamentalism to the religious values of these early Christians. And it wasn't a big leap to go from their values to their mythologies and to see them in a struggle with the Roman Empire and used comparative mythology as a way of managing that.
Just one comment. I have a lot of videos with you, Dennis, for everybody who's watching that I haven't made public yet. We probably have 20 or 30, maybe 35 videos. And in one of those, I actually get your testimony. And there's a moment when you were at your conservative college and Martin Luther King Jr. was shot and killed.
That's right.
And they did not give him any respect. They showed him very little respect. And it was a sign. Can you make a brief comment on that? That was a powerful moment in your testimony. I will have that video up at some point, but
I'll give you a very brief version of it. When I was in an auditorium with 3,000 faculty and students at Bob Jones, and the president of the university at the time, Bob Jones Jr., came to the stage after a lecture by a John Bircher, and said that Martin Luther King Jr. has just been shot. This is April 2nd, 1968. And the president has asked us to fly the flag at half-mast, will not fly it for an apostate. At which moment, my friends, everybody that I could see stood up, cheered, and clapped. In the dormitories, we were to have prayer meetings every night. And I went back to the dormitory prayer meeting and I said, we're not praying. We're talking about what had happened. And for that kind of celebration, because anybody got killed, especially someone who's attempting to be a moral spokesperson and as a Christian minister, that is just outrageous. The next day, I was almost expelled from the school for forbidding prayer. And so they called my dad, who was a Baptist pastor, and said that Dennis is going to be expelled from the school, and this is why. This is my senior year. And he said, let me talk to Dennis if he's there. So I talked to my dad and told him what I had said. And I handed the phone back to the dean, and I heard my dad yelling, "Gilbert, you do what you need to, but I've never been prouder of my son. And I've never been prouder of my dad." And it's that kind of hate that fundamentalism breeds, unfortunately, in some cases, not in everyone. And my father was a fundamentalist, but he was a champion of civil liberties, including the issues of race and anti-Semitism and so on. So he was a compassionate fundamentalist. But Bob Jones is not. And too many of the people who have slammed my work, I think, are motivated, I'm sorry, by hatred.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate you taking the time to tell us about that. Stop Scamming Man. Hello, Dennis. In your estimation, what did the gospel writers envision when they spoke of the Holy Ghost?
I think one of the things that's wonderful about the ancient world is that it's not populated just by gods and by mortals, but it's also populated by demons, and it's populated by angels, and it's populated by the wisdom of God. And the heavens are open. There's a kind of ladder of being in ancient literature and religion that makes it really quite confusing. And the Holy Ghost is an awful way to talk about it. It rather has to do probably with the sacred spirit. And it's the Spirit of God. It's not a ghost at all. And it's similar to what Jews would understand as the wisdom of God or the Spirit of God, as a messenger of the divine, an angelos of sorts. So there are actually whole books that are written on the various names of deities and demons and spirits and so on, so that there's a traffic jam going on in antiquity between heaven and earth, full of these various carriers of information and the demonic and so on. So I don't know that I'm authority on the field, but we have to understand that for the ancients, the universe was populated by lots of divine forces.
This did bring up the mimetic connection to Telemachus for a second, just to highlight for people. Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist at the beginning of Mark. Notice he's being baptized. It's the heavens kind of open up, right? This dove, the Spirit of God in the shape of a dove flies, or the Spirit of God flies down and rests upon Jesus. The next scenes that you see in the Gospels, once the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit rests on Jesus, as he goes out and he speaks with confidence, and he's going into his own city, and they're going, is this the Jesus that we know? Like, what got into this guy? We know his mother and his father. We know who this guy is. What happened? If you go to the Telemachus part of the Odyssey, and you see how Athena, feminine divine, flies down Telemachus, and really, I forgot to add the detail. This detail will become clear. Tells Telemachus, because Telemachus is starting to doubt if he's his father's son. He's wondering, like, is Odysseus my father? And she kind of reminds him and empowers him and says, he's not only your father, Telemachus, he's coming back. And he's not dead. Like, don't worry, he's not dead. Telemachus goes and speaks to the suitors in the house and lets them know, like, my dad's alive and I'm not afraid of you assholes. And they're like, what got into Telemachus? Well, what the heck? Why is he being so confident? This isn't the same Telemachus. That same kind of idea is what you are showing the divine flies down to the person that they're empowering. And I thought that was an interesting connection, just because they brought up Holy Ghost. So thank you so much for that. Space Checker says, can you guys go into why it's probable that Mark knew Homer and how Greek was taught in antiquity, please?
Everybody knew Homer. If you could write Greek, you knew Homer, because Homer was the backbone of Greek education.
It's like saying, can you prove that everyone in America knew the Beatles?
Yeah, but even more so, the Beatles don't determine cultural identity the same way that Homer did.
True.
So that one of the first lines that boys, because girls didn't have this education, was the rule, the boys wrote was, Homer was not a man but a god. And then if you wanted to learn how to write names or write the alphabet, you were given Homeric names. And so that you would write out the name Hector, you'd write out the name Achilles, you'd write out the hard names like Clytemnestra and Agamemnon. And so that you, so Homer was everywhere at almost every level. So that, and it was the reason for it, the Space Checker, is that Homer wasn't just a way of learning how to write and read. He was also learning how to be Greek. And so that there was social cachet attached to literacy that was that Homer could offer. Now, schoolboys hated it because they were learning a language that they weren't speaking at home. They weren't speaking with their friends. So they had to learn this Homeric Greek. And in many cases, they didn't even know what the language was. So they had to have their own lexicon that went from Homer to Koine Greek. And we still have copies of it with Apollonius Sophista. So it's a great question, but everybody knew Homer. And if you could read Greek, you've been exposed to the Homeric epics visually. Now that, by the way, isn't a postulate of mimesis criticism. That is well known by all classicists. So that piece we can take home.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Space Checker. Gaius Julius Windex, what happened to Eutychus in Acts versus Homer?
Yeah, there's a parallel to Eutychus in Elpenor, who is gets drunk at Circe's house, falls, and his soul goes to the netherworld. And by the way, he's called Unfortunate Elpenor, and he meets Odysseus in the netherworld when he goes to see Tiresias to find out how to get home. And Odysseus goes back and back to Circe's island, and with great tears buries the body of unfortunate Elpenor. Eutychus similarly. By the way Elpenor dies is he gets drunk and falls down and breaks his neck. Yeah, the story in Eutychus is Eutychus, whose name means lucky, by the way. Similar.
Opposite. Yeah.
The opposite of unfortunate Elpenor, falls, it breaks his neck, but doesn't die. And at dawn, instead of burying the body, we have a resurrection. And in both cases, the burial and the resurrection happen at dawn. And Luke wants the reader to see this similarity.
Yeah.
And by the way, the Elpenor story was imitated twice in Virgil's Aeneid, so it was widely known.
Wow. So they're basically Luke's saying, look, guys, in your world, you're going to Hades, you're doomed. But if you have Jesus, you'll be resurrected. You'll be saved forever.
And lucky.
And lucky, right. Yeah, exactly.
Who doesn't want to be lucky?
Right.
Seriously, appreciate that, Gaius. Next one we have is Teresa W. Curious if any literature scholars have taken a look. It seems like it needs new eyes, a different perspective. Enjoying the book.
Actually, I think, yes, I want literature scholars to take a look. But I also want biblical scholars to take a look at literature scholars. That is, I think there's a lot to be learned by an appreciation of comparative literature generally, and how that works, how the human imagination eclectically puts together characters and episodes to make compelling narratives. So I think we need to have a symbiosis between fields that open up biblical scholars to more robust understandings of literature. And by the way, literature is full of imitation. It's hard to know a genre that isn't, I mean, how many people imitated the genre of Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie? Right? I mean, so it becomes a growth industry. Well, I think the same thing happens in the New Testament.
Thank you for that. Hi, Dennis. Is there an issue of tablets and text languishing in archives, not publicly available, and there for scholars to write on at their leisure?
I don't think so. I don't know of them, but we can always hope. I don't think we have tablets, but it's quite possible that we have texts that would help us. But if they do, they might not be in Greek or Latin. They might be in Arabic, they might be in Syriac, and many of them might be in Armenian, because the Armenians were very good about preserving otherwise unknown Jewish and Christian texts. So there are parts of Philo, for example, that only appear in Armenian. So, but I also have to give credit to textual critics who have been really thirsty to find new materials and to archive them. And the ones that are most important, I think, are now available. By the way, I would want to make an argument that the right way to excavate for Q is the same way the textual critics do their work in trying to excavate for lost gospels and lost sources otherwise. So, but it's a great question. I wish we could find something more tangible in some cases that we can run with. My guess is that we will find them, but they may be in languages that are not in Greek or Latin.
I was going to ask you, the Chintona is something important there. Captain Dadpool in the house. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you do so. Sorry if you've addressed this already, but what is your response to the accusation of parallelomania that you receive from other scholars?
I think they have parallelophobia. And I would say that mimesis requires one to recognize that many ancients were parallelomaniacs. They loved the parallels. They were taught how to write the parallels. They expected the parallels. They were able to carve social identities out of the parallels to show that their deity or their community was more moral or compassionate and so on.
We have evidence of early Christians that were making parallels between Jesus and Attis and Osiris, the Nicene hymn. We have the Nicene hymn. It's preserved through Hippolytus and Irenaeus.
Oh, well, I actually had a philosopher friend who said that almost all advances in knowledge are due to comparison of one thing or another. Wow. You have it in science, you have it in religion. So the idea, by the way, I was there when Sandmel first articulated parallelomania at the Society of Biblical Literature, and people were hysterical. They just laughed and laughed. And I did too. And there's a truth to it. If these texts are not simply riffing on earlier texts, they can be appreciated for themselves. You can isolate them and describe what's going on with characterization or the ideology or whatever. It's okay to have that kind of synchronic understanding of literature. It's okay.
I agree.
I do it myself.
That's why I like the Gnostics so much. Derek, can I show them the Nicene hymn real quick?
Sure.
I have it right here. So this was a hymn to Attis originally, but according to Irenaeus and Hippolytus, two sources that we have that both say this, they said this hymn was taken by a man named the Nicene preacher in the middle of the 2nd century. He lived in Turkey, somewhere in Turkey. And he took this hymn, it was a Homeric hymn to Attis, and he basically said this is to Jesus now. So he says that Jesus is born of Kronos, Zeus, Rhea. I hail thee, Attis. The Assyrians call you Adonis. All Egypt calls you Osiris, and so forth. You can read the whole thing yourself. Phrygians, Pavis, he's naming all these gods in there and saying that Jesus is those. Basically, what he was saying was what they are looking for in those gods that really is found in the Christ. So we have evidence of early Christians doing this. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, you said it best at one point, Dennis, that the ancients lived with parallelomania, meaning they were doing it. Indo says, why do apologists like McClatchy dismiss this so quickly? It seems crazy to me. Reminds me of Carrier pointing out how the Gospels just copied from Psalms. What are the good arguments against this?
Against McClatchy? Is that what you're saying?
Well, you don't even know who he is, and I do. So he dismisses your work because it's silly, because he already thinks that everything in the Bible is just look. There might be
okay. I have an answer. I have an answer. I think.
Okay.
I would like to sit down with him and show him the parallels that we talked about today, or he could choose any number of dozens of parallels. And I just want to know, according to your view, how do you explain these parallels? That is, I'm not interested in theological discussion or philosophical abstractions. I'm interested as a historian and as a classicist to understand how texts work. Now, if you can't tell me how the text works, then I'm going to appeal to what I think is the better way of understanding the text. So the text itself disclaims what McClatchy says. I want to say that another way. I'm not the one to dismantle his arguments. The texts need to dismantle his arguments. And if his arguments don't make sense of the text, then I'm sorry, but I have to attribute what he's doing to something else than honest intellectual investigation.
Right.
Thank you, Indo. Skimmerman says, what does the Greek word rendered heaven mean, and does it appear in other texts? By the way, well done on going from 50 to 90K so quickly. A generation of scholars will develop through what you've made.
Yeah, well, congratulations to you, Derek. Of course. The word heaven in the New Testament simply means sky. It is precisely the same word as sky. It's where we get the word Uranus or Uranus. So it just means the sky. That's it.
Thank you so much. Stop Scamming Man. Appreciate the support. Dustin Curley says, not to sound too sensational, but this kind of work and dialogue is so needed. People are literally dying emotionally, spiritually, and via suicide because of the grip of religion in all its forms.
My wife is a therapist, and she sees it all the time.
Wow.
All the time. And religion can be wonderful. It can be life-sustaining. It can motivate people to do love and justice and to care for the world. I'm not against religion. I'm against bad religion. The analogy I give is I'm a musician. I play a 5-string banjo. I love music. I hate bad music. And as a scholar, I'm not going to get rid of religion, and I don't think I need to. But I want to make a lot of good religion and avoid lots of stupid religion. The same way I want to get rid of a lot of bad and stupid and harmful music. So religion and music are human constructions. They're not divinely given. And we have to use our judgment to determine which ones are going to be life-sustaining and life-giving and which ones aren't. And that's going to differ from person to person and from group to group. That's okay. But don't anybody tell me that they have a direct revelation from God that's going to tell them that their way of viewing the world is right. I'm sorry, Mr. McClatchy.
Thank you so much. MacDonald coming in hard. Gettysburg Demoniac. I've read all of Dr. MacDonald's books and have loved every single one. His work and his course with you are worth every single penny. Such a brilliant gentleman and scholar.
I'm humbled.
Nice.
I'm humbled. Thank you.
Look, when I crafted that course, part of my soul fused into it. So I'm telling you, it's a must sign up for. Jeffrey Anderson, what if creation was the basis for the first mimesis? What if it was necessary?
What if creation was the basis of the first? I'm not quite sure, Jeffrey, what you mean by that, but I think it's important.
You do have the Sumerian stuff going on. I don't know if you call it mimesis or not, though.
Yeah,
Derek, you know what I'm talking about, right? Because Dr. Josh always talks about how the two waters, Apsu and Tiamat, and the word in Hebrew for the deep, Tehom, is incognate with Tiamat.
Well, yeah, the way I was
heaven and the earth, all that stuff. There's like the sequence. It might be able to pass as a mimesis.
I'm having a hard time. Maybe it's because of the amount of stuff they put in here. If they're trying to assume like actual creation in the world has some like bearing on mimesis, but without a doubt, the creation stories are doing it. What mimesis can be also understood to be is like intertextuality, and that's what Joshua Bowen literally writes in his book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, is that the earlier Mesopotamians, forget the Bible, because once you get into the Bible, the people who have their blinders on will go, oh, I can't accept that. But even the Mesopotamian earlier Anzu bird myth and the later Marduk Tiamat myth, the later one is using the Anzu myth as its template. Right. We know that because it talks about the tablets of destiny. And there's a scene once the god Ninurta kills the Anzu bird that had the tablets of destiny through the clever, what is the name of the deity? Inku, something. Anyway, like the bird gets killed. The feathers, it said, of the bird travel by the wind to the other gods for them to know that Ninurta beat Anzu. Well, in the later Marduk myth, once Marduk doesn't even have to shoot an arrow, literally approaches Tiamat and is so overpowering and mighty that Tiamat is killed just by the sight of Marduk. The blood of he rips the corpse in half and creates the universe from all existence of material matter and all from her corpse. And blood, it says, is carried in the wind to blow. And a guy with my last name, an expert in this, Lambert, wrote and said that blood doesn't carry in the wind like feathers. So it's an intertextuality, almost like the author didn't really think through blood in the wind.
Yeah, it's a really brilliant way to pick up on that.
Right. So that obviously Genesis is doing the same thing, and I'm not done with that series, but that's what best I was getting out of this, Jeffrey. And DJ Frank 68 says, does the use of chiastic structure in Mark have any relevance to your hypothesis?
That's a learned question. And there are some suggestions about chiasm in Mark that I think make some sense. A good example is that you have Jesus's Jewish trial, then you have Peter's denial, and then you have Jesus's Roman trial. And so you have two trials on either side of Peter's denial, and it makes Peter's denial even more objectionable. You have other examples of it too. There are two issues related to problems with chiasm. One is and I just acknowledge that it happens, but it can be very subjective. And difficult to interpret, and especially if it becomes so obscure that readers are unlikely to benefit from having seen chiasm, though chiasm was widespread in antiquity. The other is that I don't think in the case of Mark, he's as interested in chiasm as he is in literary imitation. So I think what you need to do is to do some research with comparing what others have said about chiasm and what I say and others would say about mimesis in Mark, and see if there aren't any correlations. I would be surprised if there are none, actually, but I just haven't worked it through.
Thank you, DJ. I got one more. Gloves are still off here, Dennis. I'm going to show you my private message here, and this is something that Jonathan sent me. McClatchy says, on the stream with Dennis, can you ask him how he harmonizes his thesis with the positive evidence for taking Acts as history, such as the numerous undesigned coincidences with the Pauline corpus and points of external confirmation? I haven't seen him address that anywhere, and I'd be interested to know his.
Has he ever established if he's read MacDonald's work yet?
He hasn't. I cannot
That's
imagine
so
he's
silly
read.
to me that he's even talking about. Like,
No, but his question's a legitimate one.
all right.
Okay, so let's take it for face value. And I think instead of reading my work, he needs to read the work of my good friend Richard Purvo, to whom I dedicate volume 2 of my synopses. And he has shown, I think, with absolute clarity, that the author of Luke Acts was familiar with a collection of a few of Paul's authentic letters. And he used them as a way of crafting a narrative so that people familiar with the letters would also see where these characters fit into the Pauline narrative. So I don't think this is independent historical information. I think it is a matter of mining the Pauline epistles, especially for names and places, in order to help generate the narrative. So that would be my answer. And Richard's work, his Hermeneia commentary, would be a much better resource in answering your question, which is a legitimate one. And I'm appreciative that you're listening to this. And I hope you will accept my challenge to give a better interpretation than I have given of parallels between the Gospels and Greek poetry.
Well, I don't think he's going to make any parallels to the Greek poetry. If anything, he'll do what most apologists do, and they'll try to find parallels to Hebrew Bible only. That's the biggest apologetic I see, is they'll poo-poo anything non-Jewish or non-Christian and only allow the scriptures, because they need that to be the position they have. It can't be eclectic. Another thing is they're going to dismiss that Acts is using Paul's letters. They don't accept that. They want this historical kernel to be there. They just can't imagine that being the case, or they're not factoring that in. And then when I do hear them say stuff like, well, look at this undesigned coincidence between Matthew and Mark, or Luke and Mark, and I'm going, undesigned? Like, it knows that book. You can't call something undesigned when you know the literature is aware of the other literature. Like, how can you know that's undesigned when you know these authors are working off of the other material?
That's what I'm saying. It's you're aware of all the motifs from the Old Testament that are being applied to Jesus. You're aware of, there's 30 of them at least. You know all that. So what is it? So like, you know, the process is there. You know, the authors are doing this method. It's like, it's in Greek. You're so
okay. I want to say one more thing. I think this is a good thing to wrap it up on.
Yep.
Matthew is imitating Mark. To understand Matthew isn't to say that he knows the gospel genre. It's to say that he knows Mark and he's imitating it. Luke is imitating Mark and Matthew. So that, in fact, the synoptic tradition is a sophisticated mimetic chain. So unless one appreciates that mimesis is actually at the heart of gospel production, you'll never be able to get to these historical questions as you want.
I like what you said there. because the critique, if someone like our friend here in the chat, Handsome General, I agree with this assessment. Undesigned coincidence equals copied from previous source. But here's the deal. It gets more complicated because they'll go, that you're not accurately representing our material. And they'll have examples they go into. But what I find ironic is they'll find stuff and go, well, you're saying it's working off this material. Why didn't it copy it verbatim and just write it out here the same way it is there, as if it can't have liberty of reworking the material how they see fit?
Oh, that's not how literature works. It isn't.
Well, let's give a plug here for your book. I have your book here. For those who haven't actually checked it out, I hope that people will. We've been working our butt off. And Dennis, this book is fantastic. Tell us a little bit about it and why people should get it, so that they also want to come back to, you want to come back on the MythVision, of course, but tell them about the book real quick, if you don't mind.
750 pages that are divided into 3 volumes. The first one's on the Synoptic Gospels, including my reconstruction of Q. The second is on selective passages from the Acts of the Apostles. And the third is on the Gospel of John, that is divided into the 3 compositional layers of the Gospel. It is a reference work. One needs to use it as one would use another Gospel parallel or a commentary. So I don't expect people to read through it from beginning to end. I think it would be helpful if they read the first 60 pages continuously, which would give one a sense of the methodology and so on, and a few examples. So it's there to be on your desk next to your other commentaries and Bible or the gospel parallels, and it offers things that you're not going to get elsewhere. The parallels are organized chronologically, not canonically, that it goes from Q to Mark to Matthew to Luke, and then the next volume is Acts. And by the way, the Gospel of John knows the Acts of the Apostles. That's one of the things that's really not understood well. So it's a reference work. By the way, I'm doing another book that is called Homer and the Quest for Q and Jesus, which is more of a sustained argument for the lost gospel Q, which is not the Q of your fathers or mothers. So, but anyway, that's what this book is. It's a reference work. It's 570 pages of things you're not going to find elsewhere. You can get it now for less than $30. I don't know what else can sell it. There's nothing like it out there. And by the way, if you have this book and you take it seriously, you're going to know more about the Gospels than a lot of scholars who've devoted their lives to this material.
That's a fact. This is like, this will put you right up in there, above the beginners level, up into the experts. You know what I mean?
There's so much there. Also want to give a plug here. This is the course. So for those who don't know, this is the website, mvp-courses.com. I just posted that in the chat. I'll raise it up on the screen so you can actually see how to find it. But here's the webpage, the landing page, the website for the courses. We have multiple courses, and this one's done really well, Creating Jesus, Why Gospel of Mark Was Forgotten. But the one with Dennis here is, I just put so much editing into this, and there's so much of his work that highlights this stuff. Here's an introduction to the course with reading recommendations and all sorts of stuff. Lecture 1, 18 of these, and the video's pretty good size, mostly 20, 30 minute, maybe a little over. It's all in 4K.
It's all really high quality stuff. Perfect quality. I
mean, that, you got to admit, that is some serious.
Lots of visuals, lots of Greek visuals, all cool stuff in there. It's really good.
Yeah, I put a part of my soul into this, and it's, if you haven't taken the course, please do so, because it goes through several examples of his book, and we actually show the book, the pages as we go through it on the screen. Here's an example just to show you, like, we're going through and showing you as we're reading through it and explaining what's going on. I mean, literally, we're taking a deep dive and teaching you. Then we have every episode, we discuss highlights, things that pop out of us, interesting things. And it helps you understand like what Dennis's work is all about. You can take what you think is good and throw out what you don't think is good. But at the end of the day, there's so much to chew on. You can't walk away and not think, man, there's something to this. Something's got to be going on. It's hard not to think that there's some imagination here that is using the Greek stuff. So I hope that people get the course now. It's down in the description. And eventually, Dennis, what do you say we do a Q&A on a Zoom call for everybody who signs up as a student?
Oh, what a great idea. I was wondering about that too, because I don't want people simply to be consumers. I want them to be creative, engaged people with this material. And I would love to have something like
Great
that.
idea. We should do that. Have a couple of them maybe.
I would.
Every couple months or something, you know?
Why not? Look, I love this. This one right here. You could never guess why, though. I'm just kidding. Look, we go all out. I got the music going. There's some great scenes here. Just really well done, and I'm proud of this one. I have to admit, I'm very proud of this.
This is good work, dude. This is good work.
Yeah. So there's my little shameless plug. Neil, thank you for joining me today. Did you want to say anything before we give the final word to Dennis?
Just check me out on YouTube. Type in Gnostic Informant in the search engine. It'll come right up.
That's right. Let me plug that here for those who have never heard of you, and I'm shocked if they haven't. You just did a great episode with John Kloppenborg.
Yeah, Kloppenborg. That one took off pretty quick.
You've done a couple. You have some more stuff coming up?
Oh, yeah. I've got video almost edited right now. It's about to maybe even be out tonight, probably, or this, by tonight, probably. It's got some good videos coming up. Yeah, there's tons of stuff coming out.
Well, I hope people will obviously check out, subscribe to your channel. They can also support you on Patreon. You are doing this full time. So if you like what you see, help support the people you like. Thank you. Dennis, last words from you, my friend. What is the takeaway?
If you want to know what the spirit of the Gospels is, it's to use creativity to create something compassionate and beautiful. And we need that. And nobody can teach you that. That's going to come with your own imagination and your own commitment. I trust that you're going to carry on what the Synoptic Gospels are about. That is the creation of a compassionate world that makes it fit to live in.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate everybody for watching. Hit the like button and get his book. Check out the course. Let us know. If you get the book, leave an Amazon review. Dennis is looking, and he's watching to see that he's getting book sales, but also that people are leaving Amazon reviews. And that means a lot to him and to me, because that will give Dennis incentive to want to come back on and take deeper dives on MythVision.
I'm honored, by the way, to be treated by you two gentlemen. So thank you.
Well, Dennis, if the guild doesn't want to take a look, I can tell you we'll start a new guild. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you. Everybody, we love you. And never forget, we are MythVision. Have a good one.
Son, do you want to know what the truth is? After this, there's no turning back. You take the blue pill and you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill and you stay in Wonderland. And I show you just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth. Nothing more.